Good morning. Happy World Wetland Day. My name is Carolyn Gannett, and I'm the manager of the Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan and the chair of the Native Prairie Restoration Reclamation Workshop Planning Committee. I will be the moderator for this morning's session, Invasives Part 1. I'd like to start by stating that we respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For a millennia, they have worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. I would like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. I would also like to note that all the presentations this morning are being recorded. To our webinar attendees, you will be muted for the duration of the presentations. If you have any questions for the presenter, please type them into the chat pod within this Click Meeting box. And any questions will be moderated at the end of the presentation as time permits. I would also like to remind everyone that the public session chat on Feed Loop on the right-hand side will not be moderated. So first up, I would like to invite Chris Tenzin from Trace Associates, our platinum sponsor, to introduce our first speaker.
Thanks, Carolyn. And yeah, thanks, Carolyn and Caitlin, for all your hard work getting this conference going. As we were talking about this morning, I think a virtual conference is actually harder to put together than a real conference. But you guys are doing a great job, and from my end on the outside looking in, it's been seamless. So congratulations and thanks again. So yeah, Trace is proud to sponsor this event. Great event, and looks like we have great attendance again this year, looking at the numbers under that little green dot. So yeah, without further delay, on behalf of Trace Associates, I'm pleased to be able to introduce Kelly Cooley of CoolPro Solutions. CoolPro Solutions Environmental Consulting was established in 2010. Kelly has just completed his term on the North American Invasive Species Management Association Board of Directors from 2015 to 2020, including service as NAISMA's president. He continues on most of NAISMA's committees. Kelly lends his experience to several organizations, including the Crown of the Continent Managers Partnership, that's the Crown Terrestrial Invasive Plant Network and Landscape Conservation Design Team, the Southwest Invasive Managers, and the Alberta Conservation Advisory Committee for the Nature Conservancy of Canada. So Kelly's a busy guy. Kelly served as agricultural fieldman for the MD of Pincher Creek from 93 to 2010, where he managed agricultural and environmental programs. And finally, Kelly grew up on a family farm in southwest Alberta. Their mixed operation included native prairie with a view of the Canadian Rockies eastern slopes. Kelly and his family are active in local recreational sports and community organizations, share a love for music, and enjoy raising their 4 children. They maintain country roots on 80 acres south of Pincher Creek, escaping to hike in the mountains whenever possible. So here's Kelly.
Thanks, Chris, very much, and welcome to all the attendees, virtual attendees, as it were. So I'm going to turn off my video and turn on my presentation. So I won't be able to see anything but my presentation. If you need to change something there, Chris or the moderator, please let me know with an audio prompt. All right, so my presentation is titled Invasive Species on the Prairies, and this is a shot in the title splash of my area, actually just north of Pincher Creek and very close to the BC border on, I guess, upland prairie in my part of the world. And we'll get back to this spot a little later in the presentation. So the last part of the introduction that Chris just said is the one that really describes me best, I guess. I'm a country kid at heart, and did grow up east of Pincher Creek. And our mixed farm was basically, my dad was more of a farmer than a rancher. We had cattle. If my dad couldn't put it into farm production, then we had to run cattle on it. So I grew up actually appreciating the native prairie that ran just north of our home place and a little bit to the south. And this is a view of that. This is my home, and if you look at that farm in the background, that's where I grew up. And this area is one of the natural drainages outside of the foothills of the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains. And these sandstone outcrops that you see in the foreground were a favorite place for me to play. And we still, even though our farm has now been sold and my parents are retired, we still go out there. We know the new owners, and we like to play out here and take the kids out and connect with a piece of the prairie that we used to steward for some time. I've grown to appreciate the prairie elsewhere as well. This is a shot of the South Saskatchewan River near the border with Saskatchewan, and my work has taken me right across the prairies in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. And I've grown to appreciate it and all its wonderful biodiversity as much as I do the mountains. It's just very, very different and on a much wider scale, but you have to get a little closer to the ground to see the wonderful biodiversity. And this is part, as you guys know, of a great network that extends throughout the continent, the plains. As these slides show, the plains are quite an expansive network. They're not all the same. They change as they go through the continent. And of course, our focus this week is on this little chunk that we call the prairies, which is a French word for meadow. And that was the best thing they had to describe this vast landscape that they encountered. So again, I'm going to refer to disturbance and migration and the effects in the context of invasive species throughout the presentation. Again, this is not to discredit any First Nations oral history. This is just based on interpretations of history and archaeological evidence, which is always changing. We are always learning new things. This first migration that's described here, 13,300 years ago, is based on very recent evidence, and again, disproving old assumptions about our history here. But that could change as well. And so I welcome First Nations interpretations of history, because I think we have a lot to learn and we have a lot to share. That first migration was quite impressive. The next big migration of people into the prairies was the fur trade. That was over about a 200-year period from 1640 to 1840. Another big migration occurred between 1840 and 1890, mostly from Britain. And then a wave of Eurasian migration, mostly the northern hemisphere, between 1897 and 1929, with a brief break during the First World War. The 40s to the 60s, post-World War II, saw a huge boom of migration from within Canada, from other parts to the prairies, and then more Eurasian migration as post-war Europe. A lot of people left the war-torn areas for opportunities here. And then the most recent migration is still ongoing, and that is mostly from Africa, South America, Oceania, so Australia, New Zealand, and the Philippines, Southeast Asia. It really has been quite something. So our diverse nature in Canada is also reflected on the prairies. And that first migration is thought to have occurred during a period where we had a land exposed by lowered sea levels, as you see in this slide. Another view of this is from a simulation where you can see where peoples are thought to have come over from Asia and basically migrated their way down into the Canadian prairies and into the United States as well. And this is based on some archaeological evidence of spear points and arrow points, which they've been able to detect. And again, it's interesting research. It's not meant to be absolute rock solid bedrock truth. It's our interpretation of the things we find on the landscape. And the flora and fauna were quite different back then, and many different species that we found archaeological evidence on, like these mammoth tracks that were recently discovered in where they're doing some repairs to the St. Mary's Reservoir here in southwest Alberta. And these mammoth tracks were really something to behold. I didn't know what they were at first, but they've now interpreted them as mammoth tracks. So we have a long history in this area of people following these species for hunting and subsistence. And this is just interesting to see what made it through and what didn't, and what thrived. So the last two invaded. You see moose and you see people, and invaded is, maybe a term that is loaded with some connotation, but basically they thrived and moved out from that point. And this is just a major megafauna. We are going to talk about a lot of other species that over this and other extinctions made it here to North America and thrived as well. So for a long time, the First Nations of this country and the Americas basically stewarded through their traditional ways, and lived with the land, maybe that rather than off the land. And that's something we're still learning about, and I think we still need to interpret. And the First Nations settled, and they had traditional territories, some of which overlapped each other. And again, I think there's a lot of understanding needs to happen about what took place then, and we need to look for evidence of that and support the stories that are still being told. So as colonization proceeded, these vast territories were broke up into more mathematical geographical blocks rather than following the landscape. And I'll talk more about that later. But you see from 1898, the territories changed. 1905, when Alberta and Saskatchewan became provinces in the Canadian Federation. And then 1912, when things changed again, and they've continued to change over the last century and into this one. But a lot of people came through in the subsequent migrations after the fur trade and into the late 1890s, and then this area here off Nova Scotia, Pier 21 in Halifax, was a major entry point from Europe. I was able to visit there a few years ago, and it was something to see. Both my wife and I's family were among the immigrants that came in. My wife's family was from Holland. And again, it was a new world for them, and they wanted to make the new world a lot like their old world. And this was the vehicle that transported people from the boat that brought them to North America on the eastern shores into the rest of Canada and the prairies. And this slide here just shows you the pathways by which they did that. And these rail networks that were created over the 1800s and early 1900s are something that really changed this continent. And this is only one method of transportation, but it forever transformed our landscape into our part of the plains, and also into the United States and beyond that. And again, this is like injecting a whole new set of arteries into a body, is the way I like to interpret it. And it's interesting what's come through those arteries over the years. So this is an example of a farm family from Croatia that came into the prairies, into Saskatchewan, and again, tried to make a living off the land rather than with the land, in my interpretation of it. And I come from a farm family, so that rings home for me. And that vast ocean of grass was not thought to be productive enough to sustain these families. So the cultivation of the prairies began in earnest in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And again, transformed the way that these systems work. Things that had been there for unknown amounts of time were converted to annual crops. Our landscape that is undulating and formed and shaped by wind, water, and fire had a system of grid approximation sections, a system that was done by the Dominion Land Survey from 1871 to 1881 in the Western provinces. And again, it was a system that was used in the Midwestern states that was adopted and used up here. And it was a way of establishing an order of sorts on the landscape. But I think we've come to realize that that geometric pattern doesn't necessarily work with natural systems on the ground. And we learned that most I guess vividly through the tendency to till and strip farm. The reason people did strip farming was to combat the wind, because the wind didn't go away when we imposed this geometric pattern of farming on the landscape. It actually just made it so that they would slow down the wind in between the strips. And that was the primary way of farming for some time. We've gone away from that now with larger equipment and into bigger blocks, but you can still see the Dominion Land Survey evidence on the landscape anytime you fly over it. And the problems didn't go away. We still were removing all the cover and anchor and rebar that the prairie had, and this is the result when our inevitable winds start to blow. We have disturbance on a massive scale, larger than any of the major prairie fires that would have occurred naturally over the years, because there was, again, no rebar system of plant material and organic matter to hold everything together. And my friend Al Jacklin in the photo here would be fond of saying, this is no longer soil, this is now dirt, because you've taken that vibrant mix of soil that sustains all the ecosystem on the prairie, and you've basically broken it down to its mineral components from exposure to our winds. Water erosion is also a factor when we have large rain or snow events and snow melt, and again, redistribution of soil and degradation of the surface that sustains the prairie is the inevitable result of that. And it's all part of this this migration. The reason I'm talking about it is we've gone from, just over 100 years ago, a couple hundred years at best, into this vast network where air travel is bringing people and their goods and their species that are back where they're from into all parts of the globe. And this illustrates it just amazingly. Shipping, air travel, road travel, rail travel, and urban areas. It just shows how we've transformed our world in such a short time. And it's a great experiment. Some scientists term it the homogecene, where we have these species coming in, and because of their lack of competition and predation, like many of these species, not all of them, but many of them adapt and can take over to the point where they cause extinctions of native species. And this has been happening now for a couple of hundred years in earnest, and accelerated during the 20th century. Enormous loss of native biodiversity on the local level. And as we know, the prairie is a very complex ecosystem. The portions that survive, we're continually learning new things about just how interconnected everything is, and how you take one part of it out. And again, we've been trying to make things simple and farm and ranch and live the way we do. But the systems, the weather, the rhythms of the prairies haven't gone away. They're just working sometimes against what we tend to do with our overlapping disturbances. So some of these disturbances, again, are natural. The prairies are formed from solar energy, from the retreat and advance of ice over the centuries and the melting and subsequent thing. Fire is a huge part of the prairie landscape that has developed these wonderful systems that are grass and shrub based in some cases, but mostly grass. And again, the fires are just a matter of time. We have seen some major fires. This is from Southwest Alberta from a few years back, where a fire got away and spread. This was actually in the wintertime, so this caused quite some damage. Actually, in the fall, not the winter, but dry conditions will fuel these fires with winds to back them up. And again, when snow melts, our infrastructure is no match for a roaring stream that becomes a torrent in a major flood event. Other disturbances on the prairie include those that the bison and other species of wildlife impose on it. Actually, I would say not impose, it's more that they are part of it. They are needed, they are necessary, and they did it in a rhythm that we still don't understand completely. I've been interested to see people that raise bison now and try to do it within our township range system of section blocks, and it doesn't work. Their grazing pressure is such that it hammers it to the point where it can't recover. And what they're missing is that these bison herds were migratory. They were huge, and they caused localized intense disturbance. But because they moved across the prairie without fences or roads or anything to impede them, these areas get a chance to rest and regenerate. And in fact, the grazing was part of it. These little critters, these are more upland prairie mountain creatures, but the Richardson's ground squirrel, also part of key disturbance and food source on the prairies, but they caused a lot of disturbance as well in their colonies. When Europeans came here and brought cattle with them, these were perhaps thought to be replacing the work of the bison. And again, I would argue that that is true to a certain extent, but cattle graze differently than bison do. And again, we're still working in large part these days within these very confining and that don't conform to the landscape section blocks. So we don't get what I would call a natural grazing system out of that unless we change our management structure. Horses also graze differently. Horses are a huge part of agriculture and the Western way of life on the prairies. But again, there's choices with that, and because we are limited in a lot of cases to these blocks, to these sections, you see management choices on fence lines all the time. And those choices have consequences for the prairie ecosystems that sustain us. And we cut our pipelines and our power lines, our roads, our trails right through natural systems like this. This is Pincher Creek, upstream of the town where I'm from. And again, you see even in the upland areas on the prairies and foothills, you see the evidence of our section-based system on the landscape. Looking at it from a map point of view and into Saskatchewan here, we can see our arteries that we've carved across the prairies. This is the rail networks within Saskatchewan. These are the major roads, highways, the national highways that connect us to the rest of Canada and the United States, plus the provincial roads that go through the landscape. If you add in the provincial highway system, you again see a lot of the main arteries. And then you add in the local roads, and we have even more. And keep in mind, all these things cross natural features on the landscape, most notably watercourses, and they interrupt those systems as well in so many ways. Again, this is how we get around, but when you get on the landscape, you realize that even in the southern part of Saskatchewan, southeastern Alberta, there are a lot of watercourses. There are a lot of water systems. And these local roads, every culvert, every approach, the roads themselves, every bridge crosses a natural system. And the species that run along these transportation networks end up into these natural systems and then into the surrounding lands from those natural systems. So we've really created quite a network of infection across the prairies with our progress. This is another illustration of what I'm talking about. If you look at a wheel on a bicycle, this artist in Ohio tried to approximate a dandelion going to seed by using these wheels as part of the sculpture. And what's amazing about this sculpture is that it illustrates what we've done to the prairies, because an insect or any other thing crawling on the spokes of these wheels can reach any part of the sculpture by the interconnectedness of it. And this is what we've created as a wonderful transportation system where our vehicles, the road work that's done, everything helps to spread species through the prairies. The underside, things that protect our transmissions under our trucks, are like little scoops when we get into the mud and transport species. Our wheels do it. It's a never-ending process. So managing invasives on the prairies is challenging. Because of all these areas, we have very great jurisdictional complexity, landscape disturbances that never end, and of course our amazing weather. We've got diverse different uses and administrations for these lands, local to provincial to federal to First Nations, multiple uses on these lands, and then the landscape itself is not the same from one part of the prairies to the next. You also have disturbance, and I won't read these all out, but the natural and various, I guess, human-caused activities all overlap, and these systems are, I think, in a lot of cases, being overwhelmed by all these different things. It was enough for it to recover from major events when they were all natural events coming from climate, but with all these overlapping, it's been no wonder that we've had a species change on the prairies over the last couple centuries. And again, weather, this just details what any of us that have spent prairies know. If you don't like the weather, wait 5 minutes because you're going to get a different one. And from year to year, normal means something different. I've never seen a normal season yet. It seems like there's always variation on the prairies. So a few of the species that I think are, and again, this is not even close to an exhaustive list, but time will allow me to go through probably the 100-odd species I think are of concern on the prairies. But we'll go through a few of them. The invasive brome species, I'm going to feature downy brome here, but Japanese brome, Bromus japonicus, is also a concern in a large part of the prairies. These are a winter annual. One thing that I didn't put in as a slide is something that those of you who've seen my talks before, I really emphasize how important it is for us to learn not only about the species themselves and maybe what their flower looks like, what their general habit looks like, but to really understand their life system, whether they're annuals, summer annuals, winter annuals, whether they're biennials, if they're tap-rooted perennials, if they're creeping-rooted perennials, and if they're short or long-term perennials. That's critical to understanding not only how they work, but how they work within the context of the system that we're managing. So if you're farming, ranching, that's one system. If you're protecting a natural area, that's another system. And we have to manage for what we want to grow and thrive rather than for what we don't. And in a lot of cases with invasive management, we tend to be managing for what's convenient for us rather than doing it in terms of what's the best to limit the invasive introduction and spread and control that's already there. So with cheatgrass, downy brome, this actually came to the North American continent in Washington State in an infested bale of hay in 1898. So not that terribly long ago. And again, it's a pretty innocuous looking plant with its drooping awns and fairly short growth habit. Shallow root system, doesn't hold a lot of soil, has this tendency when it matures in the late part of its life cycle, which in my part of the world is generally in May and early June, and goes red. This plant is, again, no natural enemies, being an invasive species from Eurasia, and it is highly adapted to fire. So what we've seen in the Pacific Northwestern states and now into the western provinces is that it's very adapted to fire. So a lot of the species that might be able to adapt to a 1 in 25-year fire, if cheatgrass invades the system, it replaces those species and forms a monoculture. And that's been played out. If you ever drive down to Nevada, to Las Vegas, if we ever get to do that again, I'm not a fan of Las Vegas myself, but I know a lot of people do. You can drive a good 300 miles south from Alberta into Nevada and see landscapes that have been transformed by this species into oceans of cheatgrass. And no wildlife, no livestock can sustain themselves off it, and they burn continuously. A lot of the fires in California have their origins in areas that are infested with this and other winter annual grasses, invasive grasses. So this is a huge problem, and as the climate warms, we see that this is an increasing issue coming into Canada, where it's already been a raging issue in the United States. So again, shrub species, tree species, other smaller native species cannot compete with this fire-adapted species of downy brome. And since their introduction in 1898, we now have 100 million acres on the North American continent, and that's a testament to how terrible these invaders, the worst of them, can be to our native ecosystems and to our farming systems. Ones on the horizon, they're not widespread yet, but they have some of the same disturbing tendencies as cheatgrass, include Ventinata dubia, the winter annual grass that's been termed Ventinata and other common names. This is quite distinctive in terms of its look. From a distance, they actually look like little cloud puffs on a prairie landscape. And they have very distinctive growth habits. They tend to persist in their mature and even gone to seed form for quite some time afterwards. So they're very resilient to breaking down, which is, again, a feature of the species. And again, if you don't know about this Ventinata species, time doesn't permit me to go into great detail with them, but it's been really well documented in Montana. And Dr. Jane Mangold in Montana has done some good work on this, along with Matt Lavin and others from Montana State University. So if you don't know a lot about Ventinata yet, I would encourage you to take a look at it. It was added to Montana's noxious weed list in June of 2019, and I am expecting this to be invading into Canada if it hasn't already. No registered herbicides yet, though they're working on them, and bioagents as well are not on the horizon yet. But we need to be very vigilant about this. EdMaps, the mapping system, shows where some of the locations are in conjunction to us. Great Falls is not that far away from the border, and that's east of Great Falls is the furthest east it's made it out from the Rocky Mountains, but I expect it will be making its way into Canada soon. Similarly, another mostly winter annual species, Medusa head. This is another distinctive looking plant, so you might think it's a bit like a foxtail, but the heads are actually quite distinctive when you take a look at them. These again seem to be resistant to breaking down and have proven to be quite devastating in how quickly they've spread. Again, this is mostly on the western side of the divide, but they are starting to see outbreaks on the eastern slopes in Montana, and we expect that trend will continue into southeastern Alberta and probably into Saskatchewan as well. Again, another serious species that we don't have a lot of tools to manage yet, and I encourage you, if you don't know about Medusa head, to look that one up and be on the lookout for it. We need to learn what to look for so that we can keep it out. Moving into more of a perennial species here, a taprooted perennial. Baby's breath is definitely a species that is a threat to the prairies, and you're seeing it spread quite widely in southern Alberta, particularly south, central, and eastern Alberta. And again, very adapted. Not a lot will really go after it when it gets its flowers on. Early on, animals will graze this species, but they don't seek it out. They will graze it, but they don't seek it out. And it really reproduces by seed. So not all species from this genus are invasive, but this one definitely is, Paniculatum. And it has the classic growth habit of a pink species, where you see these equal and opposite leaves and swollen nodes. So a very good diagnostic feature of these species, plus the obvious, cloudy type of inflorescence that is their hallmark. But again, we have a lot of issues with this in southern Alberta. They tend to be laid on grave sites at cemeteries, and then tumble out in the wind, and you can see them in a spread pattern out from these cemeteries all over the southern prairies in Alberta, spread out from people just paying tribute to loved ones at cemeteries. So this has been the effect. Medicine Hat has a huge issue with this species and breaking out into the prairies as well. Some natural areas in southeastern Alberta have been heavily infested as well. And again, this species likes to tumble. And as you can see on this vehicle, it was stopping for a burger. They're going to bring that baby's breath seed wherever they drive, from it clinging to the bottom side of their vehicle. And this is why this species can be a challenge to control. Phenomenal root system on these. You see from how she's holding it there that you're not going to pull this up. This is something that has to be excavated. A colleague of mine from Alberta that worked in the oil patch had an injury that forced him to reconsider his options. He went to school, learned about native and non-native species, and with his oil field contacts, did a great restoration in the Medicine Hat area to get these baby's breath species out of a local natural area where they had some rare native species they were trying to conserve. So we had a combination of people that were idle in the oil fields up north, came south, and removed literally tens of thousands of these plants from this native preserve in southeast Alberta. One of the worst weeds on the prairies and even into the wetter areas of southeastern Saskatchewan and Manitoba and into the Dakotas is leafy spurge, which many of you will be familiar with. Again, I warn people, if you don't have these species and you think they won't grow where you are, I'm here to tell you they will. Leafy spurge is something that is proven to be highly adaptable to dry and wet environments alike. Never assume that a species is not going to grow in your area, because these things are always adapting. Because they have no natural enemies, you end up with these systems that they may take time to invade, but once they adapt, they tend to be very efficient at invading them. And again, just a few shots of this pretty distinct poinsettia-related species. The creeping roots is how it mainly reproduces, so it will reproduce by seed. You see the root buds that will form shoots along the network. roots, which can go 5 meters laterally and 5 meters vertically. So again, that is something you need to consider if you're looking to manage this species. And this is what it can do. This is in Wyoming, and you see what devastation it can wreak on a plains landscape, particularly along riparian areas. But you see it doesn't stay in there; it creeps out from it, and we've seen that along the Old Man and South Saskatchewan river systems in Alberta as well. Some species to watch for: Phragmites australis, the common reed. This is a 4-meter species that likes wetlands. Again, a European Eurasian import, and it can transform ecosystems as well. If you're not familiar with this species, I know there's native varieties, but the non-native ones are really scary in their ability to transform wetland habitat and make it almost a biological desert, with very few species able to sustain themselves in the dense thickets they form. And again, they're a creeping rooted species that does disperse its seed, but readily reproduces through the root systems, which I'll show here. First time I encountered this was actually in Nebraska, and these are shots from Nebraska where this is taken over the Platte River system, and they've spent millions of dollars trying to clean this species out. Again, very dramatic spread of these species. And unfortunately, some of their control efforts in their managed river down there on the Platte was to actually rototill within the stream system, something that we could never imagine here in Canada. But it's a managed stream for irrigation and other purposes down there in Nebraska. So I think their management here actually spread this species further up and downstream, because each one of those little chunks along that creeping system can regenerate into a new plant and form a new thicket downstream. I didn't think it was even an issue in Canada until I was with my son on a trip into the Quebec region, and between Montreal and Quebec, I found that this species had done very well in Canada. And in Medicine Hat, it's very close to us. We found it on the CPR, as these species show here, or these photos show here. It's formed a little spot here, and this is really where it's important that we get on it right away. So the good folks that have experience in Brooks and the county of Newell in Alberta have treated this, and to date, this location is considered dead. We're going to continue to monitor it so it doesn't make its way through the tributaries further. And this is a shot of early detection rapid response in the county of Newell, where there's an outbreak of, a couple outbreaks of invasive Phragmites. This was a partnership with Alberta Environment and Parks, Nicole Kimmel, and several other folks from that department partnered with Newell to take out this infestation along the CP rail. Flowering rush is another one that will really disrupt. It's an aquatic species capable of transforming ecosystems, and I was fortunate or horrified to participate in an assessment of this species along the South Saskatchewan River. And I'm sorry to tell you that it has really done well. The best estimates are that this infestation started in the Calgary Zoo's prehistoric area that they used to approximate what dinosaur territory looked like. It was planted in that area and seemed to have escaped into the Bow River, made its way through Chestermere Lake, where there's huge infestations, and then further through the Bow River into the South Saskatchewan. And again, a pretty showy plant. Originally came here as an ornamental, but it is all along. We went right just into Saskatchewan on our river survey from Medicine Hat through to Saskatchewan, and we found it thousands of locations. Something that concerns me is the irrigation that's pulled out of the South Saskatchewan River, and all it takes is a little chunk of the root systems of this plant, and you could be importing that into a dugout where it could do further damage. And I'm very concerned about the spread of this. This map shows, again, if you look in the left side of the photo, 3,628 sightings. That's all along the South Saskatchewan River and the Bow River system. And we did not survey very far into Saskatchewan, but I suspect it's kept going from there as well. A little closer view of that, and you can see how it's spread. So what do we do? I could go on and on with different species, but in my career, I've learned that the what do I kill it with approach is not the correct approach. We need to be learning about these species, as I've mentioned. We need to be looking at this like a Four Seasons pizza, as a cycle, as a system of education, prevention, early detection, and rapid response of these species when we do discover them on the landscape. Integrated management, meaning not using only one tool, but using the correct tools for the life cycles and system you're managing to manage for what you want, not for what you don't. And again, an ongoing system of monitoring, evaluation of your management efforts and reclamation with a thought to restoring natural function. And that's something that, again, goes against what we've been doing for the last 150 odd years of agriculture. And starting to look back to what these systems need, whether we're using them as agriculture grounds or whether we're protecting them as natural functioning systems. So prevention, really, this is the very complex thing and probably the most cost-effective thing you can do is managing to prevent invasives from becoming a threat. So protecting healthy land and water systems. Again, that comes from learning about these things and getting so that we understand what the land and water needs, and not taking pieces of these systems out, knowing what you want to grow versus what you don't, the invasives, educating yourself, your staff, and any stakeholders that use or visit these areas, using weed-free seed, forage, gravel, paying attention to what we're buying and what we're moving, cleaning ourselves, our animals, and our equipment. You can't eliminate disturbance, but you can manage it, you can minimize it. And again, a certain amount of disturbance is inevitable, but we can do a better job than we are doing. And then again, monitoring and inspecting all the time. Learning about these species, there's so many resources today as compared to when I started my career in the mid-80s. The internet has been amazing for that. And there's ways to learn about all of these, including things like the exotic mussels, the invasive freshwater mussels that are threatening our freshwater systems in North America. We have to get out on the landscape after disturbances like large fires and learn about what's happening and what's changed, like this shot here from our area. Educating is, there's no end to it. We need to all become better educators of ourselves and people we interact with, whether they're directly in what we do or not. Everybody can learn, and we learn from each other. And again, putting our pride aside and dressing up as a leafy spurge is a good idea. Play Clean Go is one program that's taken hold in North America. It's a gift from our friends in Minnesota who created the program for their recreation community and has now been adopted. And this is me and a colleague from the North American Invasive Species Management Association on the floor of the large retail outdoor expo. This was in Utah. It's now held in Denver. And we were guerrilla marketing Play Clean Go at some of the booths of the big folks there that are selling outdoor gear, because we're all a part of spread. Our pets, our boots, our equipment. We need to be more careful when we go on trails. Make sure we're going in there clean and we're leaving clean. Boot brush stations from Play Clean Go are being adopted. This is in my home national park in Waterton Lakes on the eastern slopes of the Rockies. The Canadian Invasive Species Council has adopted Play Clean Go in Canada, whereas NASMA has in the States, and they've got a bilingual signage program, and you can become a partner of that if you visit the Canadian Council on Invasive Species website. And I think it really matters that we have to have the users, the recreationalists, all the people that want to use these territories, they need to be involved directly. This is a user that Alberta Environment and Parks enticed in with a burger lunch up in his recreation country here. This is mountain territory, but the same, I think, holds for recreationists in the prairies. And make them clean their own vehicle and see what comes off. See the seed, see the plant material that comes from their trail riding, and make it real for them. Make them realize that the species that they might pick up here might come to their home area, and the species from their home area in gravel and roadway systems might come into their treasured areas that they recreate in. And it's very important that we get this across to them. The work community too. We need to work cleaner and go work, but do it with a thought to keeping our systems clean so that we don't spread species. And obviously the boating community is learning through the adoption of these inspection stations, and we need to learn to keep our boats free of material so that they don't transfer invasives from one spot to another. Using clean seed, using clean forage and gravel is very important. My colleagues in NASMA have an excellent program, international program of inspection for forage, gravel, and now mulch. And again, I encourage you to visit the NASMA website and learn more about the weed-free forage, gravel, and mulch program, which we're now calling weed-free products. Because we need to keep these materials clean wherever we move them. If they're infested with invasives, they're going to go along these networks, whether it's rail or road, and cause an issue. So really, it's a bit like medicine. We need to be hygienic in what we do. We need to isolate disturbed areas from sources of infection from invasives, and then use early detection and rapid response to treat them when they show up in these disturbances or try to break out from them. And talking about EDRR in early detection, rapid response, it's really trying to keep things from getting out of control. So you need to know what to look for at all stages of growth for these invaders and get on them right away. Like again, I showed here in Brooks where they got to that last one through 2 days of sustained effort on a very small infestation along the railway. You need to follow through and you need to communicate. We need to document what we're doing with early detection and rapid response for it to be truly effective. And when it comes to control, there's so many methods. We tended in the last century to rely too much on herbicides, although they are a legitimate tool in some cases. Timing may be a consideration, but we need to use these other tools as well. And I'll briefly feature each of them, but they can be used either alone or in conjunction with each other at different times of the year to, again, manage for what we want, not for what we don't. So we need to know the life cycles in order to do that, to use these various tools. And we need to know what control means in our context, whether we're ag producers or protecting a natural area. You know, do we mean short-term control, single season, 2 seasons, forever? Do we mean control from flowering or going to seed? Do we mean top growth control, below ground control, movement of propagules? We really need to understand what our goals are when we're talking about control and what our timelines are. So yes, tools like herbicides are important. It matters how we apply them. We don't always have to go with big equipment, although sometimes that is appropriate. Sometimes we can combine mowing and herbicides. And,
Kelly, you have about 3 minutes left.
Okay, I'm getting close to the end here, so I'll wrap it up. Fall application for winter annuals, biennials, and perennials can be very effective on some species if that's their life cycle. And that's because just before fall, these plants tend to draw down into their root systems to get through the winter. This is an example in Cardston in southern Alberta, where they're treating in a park area for leafy spurge, and that's been very effective. Cultivation is, as I've mentioned earlier, can be a bit of a negative thing in most connotations, but in small areas, you can have cultivation be very effective on certain invasive species if the system has already been managed for annual crops, for example, or it's a construction site. So it depends on the species. It's not the tool of choice all the time. Smothering has been used as well. This producer doesn't use herbicides. He's got an organic production system, and he uses a combination of his manure from his feed areas and whippersnipping with a gas trimmer, and then smothering perennials like leafy spurge. And this is what he does in terms of his own landscape. He just keeps on it year after year, early detection, rapid response, and he's got a fairly good system. Pulling is something that can be used, particularly in small infestations in natural areas. So it is a tool in the toolbox. Fire can be an effective tool in certain situations, especially for disposing of dry things. And this is Rennie, who I hope is on this call today, this Zoom session. He's very experienced at using fire to manage invasives, and I encourage you to ask him. This is in Waterton Park, where they're trying to, manage smaller infestations of downy brome on some sensitive habitat that they're not able to use herbicides on. So this is to limit seed production. It is certainly not to eradicate. Biocontrol can be used along either insects and or sheep. And I'm just asking you, they're not a magic bullet either. You have to make sure that you know what you're doing with livestock and manage them effectively. Great examples of using these systems in conjunction with each other on the Waldron Ranch in the Foothills Prairie area here in southwestern Alberta. And if you're interested in knowing more about this, let me know in the comments and we can get you in touch with them. You need to use vigilant control along these areas. Areas of disturbance are the biggest thing where you need to be on them very quickly. As far as reclamation goes, remember that water always wins. So you need to, when you're designing your reclamation systems, strive for structural diversity. Think about disturbances that will come and be prepared to shift your strategies as your weather and other factors change the landscape you're working with. Because it is a bit like a Jenga. Sometimes you're trying to put the pieces back together and they don't always stay together. So keep that in mind. Reclamation is definitely still an evolving science. And sometimes with fire, sometimes less is more. We've learned with some of these fires that there's areas we need to intervene right away, and there's areas we need to give them some time to rest and recover. The major fire that took out huge portions of Waterton Park here in southwest Alberta, some areas are doing very well in recovering and some are not. So it depends on the system and what happens later. But this was after the system went. Next spring after the fire, the first things out of the ground were spotted knapweed in the burned areas. So these species are very adaptable. And when we build our infrastructure, when we build our trails, we've got to be careful about our seed sources and our equipment, because otherwise you get invasives along these disturbances. Industry is doing a bit better job, as you see here, but we need to be even better. We need to talk to each other, private and public managers, and share our experiences, learn how to, get the native species, harvest them like this group is doing here in southwestern Alberta, and do a good job of trying to put things back together. Agency people need to try new tools and work with other private and non-government interests, as we are doing here in southwest Alberta. So that's my message to you. Play clean, go, work clean, go, learn about these species, and be aware of their impacts in our disturbance system on the prairies. And remember what Darwin said, it's not the strongest of species that survives, nor the most intelligent. It's the ones that are most adaptable to change. Let's be adaptable and learn from our past mistakes and share with each other going forward. Thank you.
For a very informative presentation, Kelly. It was a great overview of invasive species in the prairies, from why we have them to which ones they are. We really appreciate you joining us today. We do have a little bit of time for questions. There was quite a few comments in the chat box. People were asking questions and other people were answering them. But I will post a few that haven't been answered. The first one is anyone looking at timelines associated with these invasives becoming naturalized, a valuable part of the system, as in other plants adapting to compete, predators and parasites adapting to take advantage of them?
I think that's an excellent question, Marshall. I would say that not enough is being looked at with that. I didn't really get into the specifics of when some of these species came onto the landscape, but some of the first ones that we know of came with some of the early fur trading introductions, and then the early agriculture in the third migration wave. And a lot of these are not regulated now because they are so widespread on the landscape, and most are adapted to our common agricultural annual cropping systems. So these are things like stinkweed and pigweed, and those have adapted quite well, and I would say have naturalized. There's some argument here in Alberta if Canada thistle has actually naturalized. Now, in some areas, I would maybe argue that it has, and that there are some insects and other systems that can use them. But in other areas that have not been exposed to Canada thistle, I would say that's not the case. So the answer to your question is no, there's not enough looking at this, but I think there needs to be. It doesn't mean we do nothing with these species. It means that it depends on where you are and what you're managing. So I don't know if that completely answers the question. I think this is occurring, but I think that the adaptation is a slow process in a lot of cases, and we might be talking hundreds of years. So if we take that approach everywhere in a sensitive area, for example, it'll eventually naturalize, we may lose that natural system while we're waiting for it to happen. So it really depends, but I do think more work needs to be done on what species are naturalizing and what species may naturalize and develop natural enemies.
Okay, the next one is from Rennie. from all your experiences, how would you approach bringing local partners together to develop a local weed management area cooperatives?
Great question, Rennie, and I'm glad you are here. I would say my experience has been that you need to go to where they are. Expecting people that live and work on a landscape to come to you in your event will only happen if you've gone to their event, gone to their place, worked with them on the landscape if that's what it takes, and develop a relationship with them. It is really about relationships, in my opinion. So, going to a local 4-H meeting, attending a sale, for example, and even a public speaking event for 4-H is something that I've seen where you can have, you can enjoy what they're doing, conversations can develop afterwards, going to a branding, going to a trade show. These conversations lead to things like local weed management areas and cooperatives, but we have to be willing to give people the respect that they're living and working there. We may think they're doing a lot of things incorrectly, but the only way to get that is to establish trust and dialogue. And so that's what's been my experience is we need to, put our expertise aside a little bit maybe and learn to make relationships with the people that we need to work with. And that includes, again, farmers, ranchers, urbanites, First Nations. We need to set aside our differences and focus on common goals and work with each other.
That was great. Thanks, Kelly. The next one is from Brianna. How was Alberta able to adapt the Play Clean Go program, and how can we involve other provinces?
Again, if you want to be part of Play Clean Go in Canada, you have to visit the Canadian Council on Invasive Species website. In the United States, you'd go to the NASMA website to playcleango.org, and the programs are connected, but they're being managed by different agencies in the two countries. And there's another agency in Mexico that's adopting Play Clean Go there and converting it to Spanish and language there. As far as Alberta goes, it's been a process. Some of the national parks have begun to put it into place. Nature Conservancy Canada has been adopting it and trying to incorporate it into their areas that the public can visit. And again, Alberta Parks on and off is looking at putting in Play Clean Go. They've done some early good work. I would like to see it be adopted more quickly and more extensively than it has, but it's everything from awareness days to signage along trails to multimedia, especially social media, messaging for Play Clean Go. And the great thing is, because it's been around since about 2012, there's a lot of success stories out there that you can emulate. So I would say all other provinces could very easily adopt this program. It's not intended to replace your own messaging. It's meant to tie it together into a larger message. So it augments what you're already doing. It doesn't replace it. So I would say visit those websites, get involved with the community that's using Play Clean Go, and you will learn how you can incorporate it into your province.
Great, thank you. This one is, how do we incorporate that strategy? Not sure what strategy they're referring to, but when we are seeding on reclaimed sites where invasives have the upper hand?
Good question. I've encountered that myself, and I have to advise people all the time when you come into basically a mess. And all I can tell you is the principles I outlined work. You eat an elephant one bite at a time. And so I would say with big wrecks, you have to try and start on the outside and work in. You have to continue to protect and reclaim sites that are so far uninfested, and then slowly work like a firefighter does. You ring the fire and then you slowly get it to burn itself out. And that may, again, involve not spraying every acre. It may involve the introduction of biocontrols. It may involve some mechanical control to prevent seeding. If you learn about how long the seed dormancy or the seed viability is on the species you're managing, that can help you make decisions on what types of control. But the biggest thing we have to remember is these things didn't get destroyed overnight. They won't be repaired overnight. And sometimes you're going to be managing these species and trying to gradually reduce the invaders out over the period of a quarter century or more. But set your goals realistically. People that are thinking you can find a magic bullet, whether it be grazing or biocontrol or herbicides or whatever, My experience with big wrecks is that that doesn't happen. You can slowly improve function by, again, managing for what you want, not for what you don't. So the simple answer is you have to do your homework and you have to work on protecting what's still there and what's working, and work slowly away on the areas that are out of hand in terms of invasives. So hope I answered that correctly. Give me a shout sometime if you want a more elaborate answer on that question.
That was great, Kelly. That's all the time we have for today. But for anyone who wants to chat with Kelly some more, he'll be involved in a discussion group at 11:30 this morning. And so you can find him there. Next up, we have...
Alberta.
Yeah.
if you're dialing in from Alberta.
Yeah, Kelly's in Alberta. So what time is it there? 9:30 right now? So 10:30 in Alberta, 11:30 Saskatchewan. Next up, we have Clark Brenzel, who is a provincial weed inspector with the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture. Clark will be speaking about the Saskatchewan Weed Control Act. Take it away, Clark.
Okay. Yeah, just one correction. I'm not a weed inspector. I'm a weed specialist. Weed inspectors are people that enforce the act, and I don't have that authority. So that's something that only municipalities have the authority to do. And we'll get to that in a bit. So Kelly talked about some strategies looking at working with communities and working with partners to get things done. And that's obviously going to be one of the most productive ways to approach invasive weed control for sure. What I'm going to talk about is the legislative side of things. And essentially the legislation it's the hammer for the people that are not buying into the collaborative approach. I would suggest that the collaborative approach is the one that you want to work on initially, and then only in the situations where you have problems convincing certain individuals to get on board and row in the same direction as everybody else, then you might utilize this tool. And it is a tool, just like any other tool in the management of something, and it just so happens to be sanctioned as a law within the province. So Saskatchewan has been regulating weeds for many years now, over 100 years, and it starts going back to the Noxious Weeds Ordinance. We've got records going back to 1883 for that, and that would have been for the Northwest Territory. So some of those maps that Kelly showed earlier on, where you had that giant blue area, where Regina is starred in there, that would have been the ordinance that applied to that entire area. And so when the province became a province in 1905, one of the first pieces of legislation to get passed within the province was the Noxious Weed Act. And that was addressing some of these new weeds that were on the prairies, so things like wild oats and wild mustard and Canada thistle, and to try and prevent those from getting established. And the most recent version of that, before we moved on to the Weed Control Act, which came into force in 2010, was the 1984 Noxious Weed Act. And it had become more of a agronomic practices act, because it still had some of those weeds that had been on the list for 100 years. And now those things were ubiquitous across the province. And really the only thing that was being accomplished by having those things still on the list was rocks that people could throw at one another over fence lines, essentially. And so it kind of got in the way of accomplishing the goal that we really want to accomplish with the legislation, which is to try and prevent new things from coming in and getting established and spreading throughout the province. So the Weed Control Act is a provincial law, and what it does is it places responsibility for weed control on the landowners and or the occupants of that land. So we've got a renter, it's their responsibility. If you're working the land, then you've got responsibility for managing the weeds. And hopefully if everybody adheres to that principle and they're looking after their own their own situations, then the act doesn't have to come into play. So that's the ideal. And one of the I guess little differences between the Saskatchewan legislation and our neighbors on either side is that Crown land is not bound by the legislation, where it is in Alberta and Manitoba. And so that also presents some challenges, but it also presents some opportunities as well. It's enabling legislation, so it's not that the province enforces the legislation that they administer. It's uh, uh, legislation that is enforced by another party altogether. And so that means that the municipalities are the ones that are enforcing the Weed Control Act. And it's very similar to Canadian Border Services doesn't enforce their own legislation. They enforce legislation that's created by Canadian Food Inspection Agency, Pest Management Regulatory Agency, Immigration Canada, things like that. And so that's that whole enabling process. And the whole focus of the legislation is to prevent the introduction and spread of new aggressive species across the province. It hopefully sets and establishes priorities based on the prevalence within the province. So we really don't assess the impact per se of species that are on the list, but what we do is we focus more on the prevalence within the province, and the negative impact of those is kind of assumed. We have 3 parts to the legislation. One is the act proper. And what that does is that provides all the core rules and responsibilities, the required activities, standards, and the municipal powers and responsibilities. Pretty much, it's the framework that you hang everything else off of. Then there's the weed control regulations, and these have little things that you may want to update more regularly than you would the act proper. So if we take into account that when we did the Weed Control Act following after the last revision of the Noxious Weed Act, we're looking at 25, 30 years for the update of legislation proper. Whereas with the weed control regulations, you're looking at as little as 5 years under responsible regulation rules within the province. So we've got definitions in there. We've got monetary amounts for how much a municipality can reclaim, fines they wouldn't let us put in there, and delivery options for orders and things like that. Also in there are the basic structure of the forms that would be used in enforcement. And then the third part is the minister's order to designate prohibited, noxious, and nuisance weeds. And this is where the Saskatchewan legislation kind of departs from other legislation as well, where often you'll have other legislation has the weed list in the regulations, whereas we have it now in the minister's order, and we'll get to that in a little bit. So the real cornerstone of the noxious or the Weed Control Act is the 3-leveled weed list. And it's all founded on the idea of early detection and rapid response. And Kelly had talked about that a little bit earlier. And so it's been adopted in other areas, and we kind of borrowed it from Alberta, to be honest. So our categories are prohibited, noxious, and nuisance. And if we compare that to Alberta, they got rid of their nuisance category pretty much the same time we were introducing our 3 categories. Manitoba has now introduced 3 categories into their legislation. So they've got tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. And that progresses down into the US as well, into Montana. What this 3-tiered list does is it gives an obvious reflection of the concern around a particular weed species and the level of attention that it needs. And it allows enforcement intensity to vary depending on the weed species as well. So if you've got a prohibited weed, the goal is eradication. If you've got noxious, then you want to contain and control the established populations so that they don't spread, and then pick off isolated satellite populations to make sure that they don't get established in new areas. And then the nuisance category are weeds that are ubiquitous everywhere, but they require just a slight change in management of the land. in order to bring those into step with the areas around them. So this is the invasion cycle and how it interacts with the Weed Control Act. We've got various species along that invasion curve from when it just gets introduced into a location, and this concept can get applied at the country level, at the provincial level, at the municipal level, and right down to the farm level. So early detection and rapid response can be applied to all types of scale. So if we start on the right-hand side, these are the ones that have been here for a long, long time. They are pretty much everywhere. They're ubiquitous on the landscape. And when we spend $1, and you look at the bar on the bottom there, if we spend $1 on management, we get anywhere from $1 to maybe $5 return from that control measure. But the further we go to the left, the bigger the return we get on the dollar spent within that area. So the further down the slope that we go, and the closer we get to prevention or exclusion, those activities pay for themselves way higher returns than just waiting until it gets established. And you can see where our weed categories lay over the top of that as well. There's a lot of stuff going on in here, but you don't need to really get too worried about it. Essentially, prohibited weeds aren't in the province yet, or they're very, very rare, and they've just entered the province and they're just starting to get established. And again, so they've got demonstrated aggressiveness in other areas, and Kelly talked about weeds that are growing in Montana and North Dakota and places that are nearby. That's where we look to find our next problem coming along, and potentially into neighboring provinces as well. So we've got a whole slate of those, and the ones that are bolded and have the asterisks on them, those are the ones that are actually in Saskatchewan right now. All the rest of these aren't in the province that we're aware of. So if we have a prohibited weed that gets found, the municipality has certain powers and the weed inspector has certain powers. The municipality can pass what's called a prohibited area bylaw, and essentially that's a quarantine bylaw is essentially what it is. It means that they're going to contain that infestation and add a buffer that they might need to make sure that it doesn't spread outside of that area. That bylaw term can last for up to 5 years, and then it could be renewed after that if it's felt that it needs to go further. And the idea is to make sure that it's inspected every year by the weed inspector. Anything that emerges gets taken care of very quickly with the most effective management practice that you have. And that management practice is going to depend on the life cycle of the plant. So again, as Kelly said, understanding the life cycle is important. And we want to make sure that that thing doesn't set any seed, and that if there are any seeds that have deposited in the area, that we can exhaust that seed bank fairly quickly. We can put up barriers to prevent largely two-legged critters from getting into that area. And we can prohibit seeding of crops or the entry of any machine, domestic animal, or person into that prohibited area in order to prevent it from moving out of that area. And crops may be destroyed in that situation as well. Noxious weeds, these, if people scan down through this list, a lot of more common names pop up and things that people are familiar with. Essentially, noxious weeds in Saskatchewan are those that are established in the province beyond any hope of ever eradicating again. So they're here to stay. They're not going to go anywhere. But what we want to do is we want to try and slow down their spread. If we're really lucky, we might be able to shrink the size of the infestations of established ones, but we're not really holding our breath on that. Realizing that we have limited resources, essentially we want to contain those things to where they are and not allow them to spread to areas where those plants aren't known to exist in the province. And so for enforcement with noxious weeds, if they occupy an area of less than 5 hectares per quarter section, then eradication is the goal. And so, again, crop destruction can be ordered if that's necessary, if there's no selective means to address that particular species. Then the weed inspector would have, in that case, would have to go to his local councillor or his reeve in order to get permission to destroy the crop in that case. So a little more of a bar to try and get over than you would with a prohibited weed, where you don't require that authorization. If the area is greater than 5 hectares, you want to make sure that that area is contained with aggressive management around the outside of that infestation, and then within that contained area, using integrated control measures in order to reduce the intensity of that thing on the landscape and potentially improve the productivity of that land and the ability to make it useful. Typically, orders and agreements where you would that you would use in order to put these things together, these requirements together on the landowner. They can span a period of 3 years, and what that does is that helps in the case where you've got organic producers that may not have the same tools available to them that a conventional producer would. Have a period of 3 years in order to bring that land into compliance with the legislation. It doesn't mean that they have 3 years to start. It just means that they have to work. They have the ability to work at that for 3 years, and as long as things are improving, then they're in compliance with the legislation. And there's also provisions in there to prohibit the movement of materials, machines, and domestic animals if they have weeds adhering to them. Nuisance weeds are ones that are pretty much widespread or ubiquitous in the province, but generally they can still be a problem for agriculture. These can include native species that can be problematic from time to time. But the goal of this is typically to change the management practice in the area to make sure that these things are not out of line with the areas that are around that parcel that it's being enforced on. So largely we're looking at working on integrated weed management in order to address those species. The other difference with nuisance weeds is that the weed inspector can't just be driving along the road and go, oh, there's one of those species, we'll have to stop and have a look. He can only respond to those in response to a complaint. Whereas the other two categories, if he is driving along the road and he sees them, he can start enforcing just on visual confirmation of the weed in that area. And again, same as with noxious weeds, orders and agreements can last for 3 years. So our weed designation system via minister's order, the reason that we went that way is that it was felt that the weed designation process was an administrative function. Because it's less involved from a regulatory perspective, it does allow a little bit more flexibility and ability to respond rapidly to new weeds threatening the province. The tiered system breaks weeds into groups and establishes priorities. But again, we needed a simple way to separate weeds, so it's just geographic distribution, and again, the negative impacts are assumed based on their reputation in neighboring areas. So what this means is that municipalities have to focus enforcement on the prevention of newly invaded weeds at the point in the weed's life cycle when those efforts are going to bear more fruit and be lower cost relative to the benefit that they provide. Monitoring is going to be a more important part of enforcement, especially with prohibited and noxious weeds. And intensity is related to the category. So you may have different management practices for different weeds. And one of the things we were finding with the Noxious Weed Act is that urban municipalities were using it in replacement of their untidy and unsightly property designations, and then saying, well, it's not us, it's the province. So we kind of got rid of that practice as well. And it also allows more integrated management for some of the noxious and nuisance weeds including things like biocontrol, which was very difficult under the old legislation. So essentially, a weed inspector is made aware of a concern, whether that's through complaint or he sees it on his daily drive, approaches the landowner or operator about the problem, and generally the idea is to pursue an agreement first, so that's a bilateral agreement. Only if the owner or operator is not cool with the idea of developing an agreement, it generally wants to be uncooperative, or doesn't live in the municipality, province, or further afield, then the weed inspector can move to an order. For both the order and agreement, the person that receives that notice has 5 business days to implement the actions on there, unless it's indicated otherwise in that order. If the work's not complete, the inspector can come, get the work done. Then the cost of that is added to the taxes and claimed back by the municipality in that fashion. There are fines under the Act. They're much tougher to pursue. The maximum of fine is $5,000. There's about 9 offenses that you can have fines for each one of those offenses, and you might have multiple for each situation. And just to keep in mind that simply having a regulated weed on your land does not warrant a fine. It's unwillingness to take action against the regulated weed that moves you into that fine category. So if you're poor unlucky sod that ends up with something on your land, fear not, work with the municipality, and you're not going to end up getting taken to court. It is a summary offense, so it requires the municipality to go to court in order to settle it. And essentially, it's kind of like traffic court, where everybody goes into the courtroom, the judge hears everybody's cases, and then renders a verdict right there, and then everything's finished. So it's a fairly quick and clean process. If we look at materials and machinery, we've broadened that to include anything, essentially. So in theory, material could be water, snow, soil, aggregate, plant material, fabric, wood, machines, or pretty much anything that's man-made and mobile. And domestic animals are all manner of critter that we hang around with. And the idea is it's intended to prevent the movement of prohibited and noxious weeds from locations where they are to locations where they're not. And so that's just the simple ins and outs of it. There is an appeal process under the legislation, and so if a person feels like they're being unfairly dealt with respect to the Weed Control Act, they have that time in which they're required to get the work done in order to notify the municipality that they're appealing that order. Then essentially the municipality either hears it through their council or through a board that they appoint. If the person loses that appeal at the municipal level, they can also appeal now to the Saskatchewan Municipal Board, and then all the parties would go there, debate that before the municipal board, and they would make a decision on that. It doesn't mean that the control needs to stop on that parcel of land, and we have had situations where we've got perennial appealers, and the goal there is to try and just forestall any activity on the land infinitely by just infinitely appealing and hoping that the municipality gives up. And so we've made it so that that doesn't necessarily happen, but the municipality has to be aware that they need to have done things right, or they could be on the hook for the cost of the weed control on that land. The regulations, they provide definitions of domestic animal and machine, also the other delivery methods. The maximum amount that a municipality can recover from an enforcement action for essentially an urban lot is $400 flat maximum. When you get beyond essentially a half an acre, what you're into is $1,250 per hectare or part of, up to a maximum of $10,000 per quarter section. And that gives lots of flexibility as far as things used to manage weeds on that land. When an appeal is launched, the municipality may require a deposit to cover the cost of that appeal if it's unsuccessful. And if it is successful, then the municipality would bear that cost. And so we put the maximum on that at 550 by polling the two large cities, and essentially they're going to get lawyers involved and clerks and all kinds of bodies involved in that. So they would have the absolutely highest cost of holding an appeal session. And within the regulations, there's also the order and agreement forms, the more formal ones. We also have working ones on our website that we do have a webpage specific for weed inspectors with lots of resources for weed inspectors on that site. Another few things that we've got clarification for absentee landlords and what they're required to do and what the implications are if they don't do that. So essentially they have to appoint somebody to represent them. And if they don't, then don't be surprised if you get a bill in the mail. And then under the legislation, a petition, if the under the Saskatchewan Weed Control Act, it says the municipality may appoint a weed inspector. They're not obligated to appoint a weed inspector, except if they get a petition requesting that a weed inspector be appointed. And these petitions last for 2 years, so that people don't have to round up everybody and get signatures every single season. So where do we go from here? The legislation is past due for review and update of the minister's order, which is a weed list, and the regulations. And there's some funky wording on the service standard for couriers that could use correcting. Overall, the act itself is fairly robust and shouldn't require any major changes. There may be a couple of tweaks that we can do to the notification requirements in one of the sections in that act. And after we established the $5,000 limit, which we thought was going to be a really big leap from 500 to 5,000, we got comments back that, well, 5,000 really isn't very much either. So that might be something that gets considered at some point as well. And so that's pretty much what I had here today. And if anybody has any questions, then I'd be happy to answer.
Clark, we have like 2 minutes for questions if anyone wants to type one in. Clark will also be participating in a discussion group at 11:30 on the Feedloop platform if you would like to pick his brain about the Weed Control Act there. There is a question. Hold on. I will post it. With regulating the movement of animals that are used to control noxious weeds, how does that impact a project that is bringing in livestock that will then move on to other projects? We follow bloom seeding times. Is that enough?
I think the idea of this is that you have a staging area where that livestock moves into an area so that they can be cleaned, whether that's walking them through a dip or something just to try and wash any seed off of them that might be there, or any seed that was in the soil that gets embedded in their hooves. If it's a prohibited weed, you're not going to be using sheep to manage it. And so it really only apply to noxious weeds. And the presumption would be that if you're moving them, you're going to be moving them to a location that has the same weed anyway, by and large. So as long as those kinds of restrictions are taken into account, there shouldn't be any issue with the movement of those animals.
Okay, thank you. That's all the time we have for questions. So thanks again, Clark, for joining us today and participating in a discussion group later this morning. Our final presentation this morning is Lee Sexton, who is the manager of Sexton Grazing and Consulting. Lee will be discussing what he knows about the management of invasive species. Lee, if you just want to turn on your webcam and microphone. There we go. And Caitlin, will you load his presentation? Thank you.
Sorry, I probably got that.
That's all right.
Anyway, good morning. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate this opportunity. If everybody can hear me okay, give me a thumbs up. I appreciate that. And two things I want to claim this morning, and that is that I am not an expert by any means. Every time I go out, I try to learn more about the grazing and how we can control unwanted vegetation. And the other thing is, I am Lee and I am a targeted grazer. Anyway, how it all began is that I was kind of a person that liked forage and grazing and animals. It's been my career, since I can remember, and it's a passion, I guess, at times for me. Almost gets in the way, I'm told. Anyway, we were sitting around one time talking about a few things, and there was a person looked over at me and he said, "You do something rather differently for a career. How would you describe what you do?" And I kind of thought for a minute and I said, "Well, as far as I can see, I'm kind of a blue collar redneck with just enough cowboy in me to be dangerous." So that's what we're going to do today, is we're going to take a look at my life and vegetation management and how I can try and help you get started, or things to look out for that people may want to look at as to whether they are good practitioners on their land. It's quite a thing to be able to go onto other people's lands, and I try to respect that and treat it with low impact, and as respectful as I can to their lands. Grazers have a multitude of reasons why they do it. Mostly it's an income for them. Whether you're urban or rural, some depends on how you do it and what you do. And I think we all need to acknowledge that we're going to be doing an integrated program. Like some of the speakers have talked about different methods, and I mean, integration using these methods is key to a good grazer, and all good grazers will try and implement all these integrated management tools. Another thing I guess I should say is for many years, I've always said that invasives are an opportunity to me. When I see something like what is on the screen right now, you'll see leafy spurge, which is probably my most favorite invasive weed. I see nothing but opportunities, and I get pretty excited when I see this. And we'll go over some of that stuff and see what's going on. Something like this leafy spurge. This infestation has been in there for 80 to 90 years, and how it's just taken over so bad, and they've tried multiple things to try and control all this, but the landscape and high water tables and things like that have prevented them from going full on at it. So I guess I've walked into this one a few years ago and tried to help these folks out and get them on the straight and narrow. Some of the things that we'll touch on today is some education on getting going and species selection. Animal husbandry is a big thing for me. I think it's important, as well as the proper animal handling. I've gained to learn more about that over the years, and as of late, definitely more types of handling that I've done that have been pretty successful. And if you're going to do something like this, I think you need a financial plan. And if you aren't willing to do that financial planning, you probably won't be in the business very dang long, because it's going to take some financial planning in order to make it a success. Now, one thing I want to also say is that, what I do is not common practice. We're probably not out in the general public as much as some other methods of controlling vegetation are. So we get, don't get looked at as much. And for some folks, it's a real paradigm shift to get their head around doing this sort of thing. So, it's a learning process and a teaching process. And I think that we're going to be doing more of that as the environment, people are starting to see a benefit from what we do. What we do can be very nutritious and very palatable to the animals. All these weeds that you folks call weeds or noxious weeds, I call food, and I call, great vegetation at times. So here's some things here that we can, kind of target in on. We do a lot of woody species. We do unwanted grass species at times, undesirable forbs, and, the noxious weeds or whatever kind of weeds you folks call them. I call them all food anyway, but I call them animal food. So we go into controlled existing plantings like rangelands. We'll go into cities where there's places that require some weed control. We go into new plantings. I've read, there's been a lot of things on potato grounds and croplands, and even into alfalfa fields, irrigated alfalfa fields, where before the alfalfa's coming up, they're putting in animals in there and eating some of the weeds that are coming up, dandelion being one of the biggest ones. Another thing that we go into is, places like gravel pits, oil fields, mining sites. We go into places where vegetation is out of control and there's a risk of fire. Fire management is a big thing, especially you're probably seeing a lot of that right now down in California and through there, where they've had all those big fires and they're trying to implement some grazing things going on there. There's many different places where we can get in and use small ruminants or other animals. I'm not just limiting to small ruminants. Some places we go in, we'll do what we call a total graze, and in some places we do selective grazing. And I do prefer a lot of selective grazing for reasons of getting more of the plant to grow harder and use its root reserves more, which is new kind of things that are coming out now that people are starting to talk more about. What species? Well, I got contacted from bison people, wanting, you got to be careful what you put in with bison. Sheep is not a good fit going into bison land, of course, because of a disease that the sheep can carry. It's MCF, malignant catarrhal fever. So you don't want to mix them. So if you're doing an integrated approach, you don't want to mix those species. But we can use horses as well on some grasses. I mean, I've had horses all my life, and I know that they're probably one of the better tools as far as eating stuff close to the ground and overgrazing. Holy smokes, a horse will do it all the time if you let them. Cattle eat a wide variety of unwanted vegetation. It's really surprising how much they will and can eat. My favorite, I guess, will be going into the small ruminants, which is sheep and goats. I like to use them when we're traveling around doing these projects. And of course, insects are a big part of our integrated approach with a lot of the species, not a lot of the species, some of the species. So some of the considerations that you might want to consider about is what's the motivation? Why do you want to do the job? What's behind it? Are you passionate about the land? Are you passionate about working your dogs and you just want a place to be able to work your dogs and make a little money? Or do you want to get into an urban setting where there's a lot of people where you can visit and do a lot of talking with them? It's just a personal preference. I've had people work for me that out in the rangelands. That's where I prefer to be, is out by myself in the rangelands mostly, and they just couldn't cut her that well. They needed people around them, and that's perfectly fine. We need people for every aspect of this. What kind of training? Well, there's various trainings that you can take. I guess I've taken 3 or 4 different grazing schools, targeted grazing schools. I took in the States and in Canada. So it's something that if you're interested in doing it, you need to seek these things out, contact me, and I can forward you on to people that are doing this sort of stuff and when it's happening, if I know of it. And you can get some training there. There's also, I want to touch on this right now, is a certification program happening right now too for targeted graziers. It's a grazier certification, and it's I'm taking the test this month and will become a certified grazier through the Society of Range Management. They are the ones that are implementing this, and it's on their website if you want to have a look at that and see what that's all about, whether you want to be one, or if you're hiring, that's the place that will tell you the ins and outs of what they're expecting. And I think it's a really good start as to what's expected of a person or of a client if you're looking to hire somebody. The investment can be all over the place. Your learning is money. I've always spent money on learning, and I think it's well worth it. It's ongoing all my life. I don't know if I want to stop. Excuse me, ever stop trying to learn. And then you got to think of a personal commitment, because some of these projects take you away and you're away for quite a while. And there's, if you have an enterprise at home, that enterprise has to be able to run by itself. So you might want to actually look at whether that's a good fit for you or not. Or if this is going to be your total livelihood, make sure that you have enough work lined up for to make that worthwhile. And then you're going to look at what your targeted area is, whether you want to be rural or whether you want to be out on the range or out helping with those types of things. There's a lot to it. We're going to talk about species here in a second and whatnot, and we're going to get into some of that stuff. What kind of income are you expected? Well, you can expect it to be all over the place. The city folks seem to be getting a lot more money in Alberta than what they do out here in Saskatchewan, and that's fine. That's just the way it is. And as far as being out on the rangeland, I don't think that there's as much involved, and as it doesn't, you're usually there for longer, so you don't have as much expenses about moving all the time. And so there's lots of considerations to think about when you're trying to get into this business, and I think that we all have to choose what we prefer. Here's a little thing here. I'm going to show you a few little things that we use over the years. I've found, like this is on the left, a single strand of electric wire that we've done, and it can go on acres. I've got, like, I guess 3/4 of at home with this type of fencing on it in various places and cross fencing and whatnot. But it's a very economical way for me. And as you can see, we got pretty good results here. We up against the fence, and the neighbor there, he's got a bit of a problem, but doesn't do anything about it, which is unfortunate. But they'll come around once they see that this other side is working as well as it is. And the one on the right is, you'll see some regrowth coming back, and that's another thing that we're going to do, is we're going to try and come back in and hit it again. We graze hard and fast, stripping plants or whatever we need to do to get across acres on, especially with spurge. I like to get across that first pass as many acres in as I possibly can, so that it can regrow and we can get on it again and have some more impact on it to do that. Here's a multi-strand type poly wire electric fence. This was pictures I took when I was at the Browsing Academy in Morrisboro, Tennessee. And as you can see, it's pretty effective. This particular picture on the right, it looks like a lot going on, but it really isn't. I'm usually not a 4-strand unless I have cattle in with my small ruminants, but I'll use 3 strands for my small ruminants, and sometimes 2 strands. I'll go down to 2 strands, depending on how big an area I've got fenced in for them. If that's, and I usually only use this type of fencing out in the rural areas. It seems to be, just in case there is a whoops and something is out. But I usually don't have a problem with that. As long as they got something to eat, deer fences are usually good. And that's the secret to a good fence, is something to eat in there, and don't push things too hard. As you can see on the left there, that this place wanted this hedge in there. It's a research station, and they no longer wanted the hedge, and they asked if could do something about that hedge. So we fenced that in and let the goats in there. And as you can see, they hammered it fairly good. This is another fencing tool that we use, portable netting. As you can see, it's got multiple strands of electric current. The orange ones that go, horizontal, and the vertical ones are plastic, but easy step-in posts that you can step in, and you carry, I think it is about 165 feet in a roll type of thing. The only thing with this type of netting is that it needs to be cleared fairly well from vegetation if you want to keep the power up on it. And I mean, it's the power that keeps the animals in more, so you don't want animals getting tangled up in that netting. So it is a mental barrier that they stay off of by having some electricity in there. The one on the right was mowed out fairly wide. We were doing a one in Hanley, the targeted grazing course there. It was a 3-day course. I had brought the instructors up from the States to do it. And we made a definite line just to make a point, that we wanted. And so we were measuring impact on that strawberry and wolf willow type thing. But it was a pretty successful event, and I had a lot of good comments from people, and we enjoyed ourselves. Herding, that's my favorite. As you can see on the left-hand side is a person mounted on the horse, and you can see a border collie at the end of the goats there just starting to run around, and you can see a white dog behind, and that's a livestock protection dog. That he keeps my animals safe, him and her, and we use the border collies to herd our animals where we're going and where we want them, and we can create various impacts there through high density and at times even ultra high density. They're crammed in pretty tight at times when I want them to be. We use a different type of competitive eating thing where they compete against each other. To eat as much vegetation as they can, and I'll tell you, they coming home out of there, we do it in different intervals, morning and evening, where we're grazing mostly, and those things come back full of sticks. Boy, they're just there's both sides of their rumens are just bulging out like they have 3 and 4 babies in them. It's just, they really tank up, and that's what I'm looking for is that. And then they go back in, and I let them settle to ruminate for a few hours so they can process all that material. And I found that I've been able to get over more acres than just letting them out there and following them around like the old shepherds used to do, and letting them eat whenever and lay down whenever. I've had a lot of really great success with this sort of thing. I like being horseback too, so I guess that's another pro for that. We are very low impact by being horseback. The other alternative would be on foot, and I'm too darn lazy to be on foot. Comes to that sort of thing. Where are we going next? Here's another thing that we do as an integrated part of the management is mowing. Multiple mowing passes, I think, are a great thing. Talk about this sort of applicator had room for a chemical applicator, but it was never put on, I guess. And to be honest, we used it some, but we didn't use it that much. Where we were was the terrain didn't allow for us to get in and out of a lot of places with this mower. You can see on the background where we had fenced there a little bit. The goats kind of hammered some bush in there. Through there because there was a lot of spurs in through that brush, so they wanted that cleaned out of there, and so that's why that looks the way it actually does. Here's another part is beetles. I talked about insects. Flea beetles for spurge is a great thing. Here we have a gentleman out collecting. We had a collection day and a great turnout. I forget how many people we had out there that day. We probably had 20, 25 people out collecting beetles and putting them through the sorter and sorting the beetles. And they were able to take beetles home and release them. And one thing about these beetles is that they need to be in a paper bag, and they need to be in a cooler with some ice packs so that they stay cold. They don't overheat in the cooler on the way back to where you're going. To release them, if you're traveling quite a distance, it's very important. This sort of thing here, I was moving them and I just released the bag in another location on the pasture so that I didn't need to keep them really that cool. I was just a few miles away, so I just run over there and let them go. And that's, just all I did is open the bag and let them go type of thing. We touched a little bit about the training and the workshops, browsing, grazing, whatever you want to call it. Some people get pretty upset with the goat people and they say grazing, and it's really browsing for goats. But I mean, I don't care. It's targeted grazing is the industry standard term. So that's usually what I use. And these training workshops are usually, anywhere from 2 to 3 days long or longer. Some of them I've seen 5 days as well. And most of them are south of the border. We're trying to do more up here. And as soon as this little COVID thing's kind of under control, I was planning to do some last year and couldn't get them done, but we're going to do some this year. I'm pretty sure that if we're regulated properly, we'll be able to host some. Like I was talking about the professional graziers, be professional about what you do. There's a lot of people out there who think that if they have 2 or 3 goats and they buy one of those electric nets, they can go to work and they want to charge a lot of money. And actually there's some wrecks going on that is bad for business, and leaving stuff the way it shouldn't be left and people having to come in and clean up behind them. And that's not what we're about. I think we need to be very professional about all this. Published information by accredited persons are a great source. There's a lot of reading out there and a lot of information about targeting different plants and how to target them. Mentorships are another thing. A lot of people will take on mentors. They're happy to. It's a great way to spend a month or a week or whatever you want to do to put into it. And most folks are kind of happy to have someone that's interested come out and spend some time with it. Some of them charge people, and some of those folks just let them in. Stockmanship is another thing that I think we have to be, pretty particular about. I like to see some good stockmanship with the animals. One touch on YouTube and social media. There's a lot of good things on there, but there is a lot of junk on there too. And yesterday I seen a posting on there, and I just shook my head and said, how did this get by? Why is this person even allowed to be on the land? But they're out there, and so be very careful what sort of stuff you are looking at, and try and contact somebody that's reputable and ask if this is the type of thing that I should be reading or listening to and understanding. An investment, it's quite a big investment at times, and it can be a low investment if you want it to be, depending on what, how big you want to be and how much land you want to cover and where you want to be. You can get a lot of education in there, fairly reasonable if you want, and these training things usually aren't that expensive. They don't charge a whole lot to be there. It's probably more your travel and your stays that are going to cost you. Landing spots. I talk about a landing spot is a very important thing. A landing spot is where you can go if you don't have a job. You need a place at home or a place where you can take your animals, that if you run out of work all of a sudden, something gets canceled, or you have to go to an alternative spot to feed your animals, you better have a landing spot where they can go. And before you go to that landing spot, make sure that you're doing the proper things with your animals by isolating them for 48 hours or so, depending on what you're targeting and what you're grazing, as to how fast that goes through their rumens, because some of it goes rather slow at times if it's very fibrous material. I got tools of the trade there. Tools of the trade for me are what animal I'm selecting to do what job, and it's very important that we understand and know that certain animals will do certain things for you, and you want to use those tools in respect to, don't try and put the wrong tool in to do the wrong job. That's probably what just because you're a hardcore sheep person doesn't mean that you want to go into a lot of bush, right? Or something like that, when a goat will naturally go in there and annihilate the bush. You'll need some accommodations when you're out and about, whether it be a tent or whether you are in a camp, or depending on how you just want to live, I guess. Mode of transportation, you know, pickups, trailers, hauling, getting custom hauling done. There's all kinds of different things that people are doing. I guess the people that have been in it a while tend to use their own modes of transportation, and if they have big jobs where they need a lot of animals, they'll hire transport to bring their animals in. I know I've done it a few times because of the numbers, and it's just more economical the distance to go. Some of the things you'll need is some fencers. You know, maybe if you're not access to power, you'll need solar panels and batteries to run that fencer. The fencing supplies that you need, you know, that night pen is made out of netting, and what we call a night pen is a place where we put the animals in for the night so that they're protected and they don't wander off. That's powered by electric fencing. So we'll use poly reels as well for that, but I'm not a big component of that. I'd rather have that netting up and whatnot. So one of the more important things I like to make sure there's a water supply, and like without that water supply, you're pretty well hooped. You need to have water there, otherwise them animals aren't gonna last very long. And we don't want to have anything like that happening in our industry. So make sure you have a really good water supply, clean water, your troughs clean, and make sure that they're, you know, clean all the time, clean out. You'll need some health. There's always something going to happen with them pot lickers. They seem to get sick just like we do. Here's my flower that I always put in on a presentation. It's our prairie lily, and it's one of my favorites. And I put it in because my really good friend and partner has told me that I got to stop and smell the roses. Sometimes let's try to put that in. And some of the thoughts, I guess. I don't, you know, have too many thoughts. I like to answer questions more, but I guess some of the things I like to see it by using animals is that we are natural, you know, invaders of the land, if you want to call it that. We go in and eat, you know, vegetation. We leave behind us our droppings, the dung, the urine, and the saliva is all important to the land, and if you're into that sort of stuff, you realize how important it really is to have that helping your natural soil biology grow. And it's, and you know, there was a movie or a documentary, I guess it is, Kiss the Ground, with Woody Harrelson was narrating it. And in one part of the show, they talked about, they said, it made a comment. He doesn't I don't keep my poop on the ground or something. I don't keep my poop in the loop. That's what it was. So we keep our poop in the loop. It's there for Mother Nature to use and for the plants to use. And I think that's very part of it. One thing I do want to say, though, if you're in the goat business and you have goats have a lot more proline in the saliva, so they'll take them higher tannin. So when they put that down there, that's a bonus for your land as well. I don't know if there's too much else to touch on there, Carolyn. If you want to open it up, I'll try and answer the odd question.
We're actually out of time for questions. Kelly has been answering the questions in the chat box, so that's been nice. If anyone wants to ask Lee questions about invasives management, you can go to the discussion group in FeedLoop.
Sure.
It might just take a little while for Lee to get over there.
Yeah, it won't take me long to walk over there, Carolyn.
I'm more worried about connection than actual walking, but yeah. So thank you so much to Lee and the rest of our presenters this morning, and to our attendees. Thanks for joining our first invasive session. As I mentioned, all three speakers from this morning will be participating in discussion groups. So be sure to check them out, and we'll see you later this afternoon.